Speak of the devil, as soon as I start reading Arc 5 due to no Season 3 news, there is a fairly credible leak that Season 3 is in early production. Unfortunately, it's too late for me to go back, so let's continue reading peak fiction. Before I get into the recap of events of the phase, there are two things that I wanted to address. Something I want to do in the future is note any light novel changes since I'm reading the web novel, and I didn't get to do that for Phase 1 or Volume 16. There are only two notable changes to my knowledge. The first one is that Garfield versus Reinhardt is much different in the novel version. Instead of having a mutual battle, Garf instinctually goes beast mode and swings at Reinhardt and proceeds to get bodied. Same effect, just much different circumstances. The second is that Emilia is much more confident in herself than the web novel, and from what I've read, is no longer having a problem with how closely she resembles the witch Pristella. Phase 2 picks up immediately where Phase 1 left off, right after Subaru's first death, which he bounced back from surprisingly well. He, however, has the shortest time span in the entire series between save point and death, giving him very little time to work with, closing in at 15 minutes. As he attempts to handle the situation in the square, we find that Sirius has quite a terrifying presence indeed, using her authority to quite literally push Subaru into an existential crisis, reverting to almost instinctual levels of fear, or as he described, a, quote, continuous, endless, infinite fear. We also learn that Subaru is not resistant to authorities, something we had assumed during his encounter with Betelgeuse, as Sirius's authority works quite well on him. This begs the question as to why Subaru was capable of seeing the unseen hand. Before his repeated death, we find Subaru putting his heroic nature on full display once again, risking it all to try and save Lesbo, harkening back to his battle with the giant mob beast in Arc 2. The first loop shows us that Sirius has the ability to link people emotionally, but the second loop shows us that she can also link people's physical beings, making both Subaru and Lesbo sick at the same time. She later uses this very authority to make it so not even Reinhardt can kill her without slicing the entire square in half. This ability is actually insanely hard to counter. I want to point out how much I appreciate when characters don't always make the most rational or logical decisions. In the age of channels like CinemaSins or amateur YouTube critics judging every single story based on character logic from the safety of their own homes, I just want to say that characters making bad decisions is fine. Characters are supposed to be people, and people do not always make the best decisions possible. It's easy to sit there and scream, please call Reinhardt to fix the situation, but that doesn't mean that if you were in this situation, you would think of that. Speaking of Reinhardt, they came up with such a great way to write him out of the situation. He sucks out too much mana for any of the plans they devised to possibly work. I really like how Subaru thought about death in this phase. Of course, he's never liked dying, but he has formed quite a unique hatred for death itself, as he's experienced it quite a few times at this point. Death was horrible, unacceptable, and no matter how much he experienced it, he couldn't grow used to it. Having his life taken was completely unreasonable. That denied his self, trampled on his existence, insulting his soul. It was something that stole from him. In hindsight, this little speech reads quite similarly to something that another character would say. Despite this unique outlook on death, Subaru shows some old traits of his once again, declaring himself weak for fearing death. Not necessarily a regression, just showing us that you can't fix somebody who is broken in just a year. Arc 5 in some sense is the culmination of Subaru's rejection of return by death. He could have thrown his life at this situation 100 times over until he got it right, but instead, he's only died 3 or 4 times in the past 2 phases. It's funny to say somebody only died 3 times, but this is pretty big for him. Emilia versus Sirius was tight as fuck, and I did not expect it at all to be so one-sided. Well, for as long as it was one-sided. I guess I just underestimated not only Emilia's combat power, but also her move to go straight for the kill. Our only power comparisons for Sirius was her versus Subaru, which doesn't set a high bar, and her versus Reinhardt, which unfairly sets the bar. This fight also shows us a furthering of the idea of Subaru spreading the burden, something he learned in Arc 4, by accepting Betty and Emilia's help, especially for the Sirius vs. Regulus confrontation. Speaking of Regulus, he finally shows up for real, taking Emilia in his arms after her defeat. We also infer that Sirius and Regulus are not quite on the same team despite having the same goal. They quite literally get into a minor scuffle despite playing for the same team. Emilia's defeat was pretty hard to read, as Subaru and Betty both felt powerless to do anything. In the face of death, personality and heroism become meaningless, Subaru thought. The fight between Subaru, Betty, Regulus, and Sirius reveals quite a lot of interesting tidbits. First of all, Subaru finally uses the unseen hand again, confirming that his body has not gotten any more use of the ability over the past year, seeing as how he's still getting severe backlash. We also get to see Subaru and Beatrice's exclusive magical system, which is actually so fucking cool. I loved this so much. They use an ability called EMM, which allows Subaru to sidestep from this plane of existence, nullifying any attack. How raw is that? EMM quite literally portrays Subaru as an unstoppable force, and Regulus' authority of nigh invulnerability makes him an immovable object. We also see that, due to Subaru's use of the unseen hand, Sirius develops an immediate obsession with him, believing him to be Sloth or Betelgeuse. Now, it's unclear, but Sirius was either Betelgeuse's actual wife, or she is just absolutely batshit. I'm not sure which one it is. If she's actually his wife and I missed it, please do tell me in the comments. This sudden obsession leads to a pretty morphed perception of love from Regulus, once again extrapolating on the many ideas of love in the series, as Regulus scolds Sirius, saying, quote, if someone you love dies, find the next one. Exercise the rights you've been granted. Regulus himself is quite an interesting character who I'm really excited to see more of in the future. He babbles on and on about manners, rights, and self-determination, but doesn't give a second thought thought about Emilia's consent, who he is kidnapping to make his millionth wife. Rules for thee, but not for me, essentially. Sirius also has some interesting dialogue after mixing up Subaru with the next version of Sloth, as she relates Petal Juice and Subaru unintentionally, describing a core character flaw that the both of them had. Quote, trying his utmost and overstraining himself alone. This is quite an astute observation for Subaru, albeit unintentional from Sirius. After Subaru gets his foot blown off by Regulus, he wakes up in a bed being healed by Ferris and hears an announcement from a new challenger, the Sin Archbishop of Lust, Capella Emerata Lagunica. Lagunica having some obvious extreme connotations. I also want to note that I noticed this before it was officially noted by Subaru, so don't come at me, okay? But a lot of major characters in this series are named after stars. I'm sure there is meaning to be extracted from all of them, but the one I was able to note about Sirius, the name Sirius originates from ancient Greek, meaning glowing or scorcher, pretty fitting after she displays her massive literal firepower in her fight with Emilia. We also get this small section of Garfield roaming the town with Mimi, and I actually really love this part. I have a soft spot for Garfield, and his characterization after Arc 4 has been great. He's clearly matured, being much more sociable and down to earth while still holding his primary goal of being the strongest, even after being humbled by Reinhardt. This growth is further shown by him not selfishly blabbering to Garrick that the woman inside the house is his mother. The situation with his mother is quite depressing to read as well, as the boy had just dealt with his trauma from the past involving his mother, only to be confronted with her actually being alive, but realizing she knows nothing of her previous life, including her 2 children. Garfield has it quite rough this arc so far, after he then proceeds to allow his hubris to catch up to him, leading to an overestimation of his abilities, which has Mimi sustain a severe injury. If he just stuck to the plan the 2 of them conceived to fight the 2 highly skilled cultists, this might not have happened. Garfield is still a fairly naive teenager. What else is interesting in this encounter is how one of those cultists has the divine protection of the Death God, an ability that leaves wounds that are unable to be healed, increasing the closer they are to their target, even going as far as reopening old wounds. The divine protection Wilhelm's wife held before her death. Could the divine protection have transferred after her death? I think that's how they work, right? Or is that just the Sword Saint? Or does somebody here have some form of resurrection? I have no idea what to make of this. Going back to Garfield, my son has taken a humongous amount of L's over the series. A boy who starts out as insanely confident, arrogant, and headstrong, losing time and time again and slowly being broken down, until he holds almost none of his confidence in the last conflict of Phase 2. I really need my boy to take a W besides Elsa. Something I also like to note is that Subaru does not waver despite for the first time being completely isolated from his most loved ones. Sure, he has some people there, but he is missing the 3 people usually tied to his hip, yet he does not falter. And okay, this is where the star thing officially gets mentioned by Subaru, and I would like to say that it's one thing to have a naming convention for your villains or your characters, like, oh, this has some interesting connotations for meta-analysis of the series. However, now that this has been officially acknowledged in canon, this is honestly a really big deal. It implies that there is now an in-universe reason that all the archbishops are named after real-world stars, rather than a meta-analysis reason. This leads me to believe that we will uncover a 4th person from the real world who is possibly in charge of the witch cult. The real question is, would they also be from Japan? We come to find out that Gluttony is here, and while this was exciting for about 0.5 seconds, we then learn that this is not the same Gluttony that stole Rem and Crucia's memories. Would killing him still achieve the same effect? Would you have to kill both, or the one that ate the memories? I don't know, but he's ugly and I think that he should die. As mentioned earlier, Arc 5 so far seems to be one massive test of Subaru's growth, which so far he is passing with flying colors. He's making every life count, never discarding a loop, and damning himself to death despite the constant pressure that is building up that can make him cave and forcibly restart. His foot is destroyed, Emilia is missing, Beatrice is down for the count, and Mimi is near death. Let's hope that he can keep this up. ReZero for the entirety of its duration has done a great job continually raising the stakes in a believable way. Each arc leaves me thinking, how could it get worse than this? Like during the loops of Arc 3, then the loops of Arc 4, and now the loops of Arc 5, with quite literally 5 Sin Archbishops holding this city. It's a shame that someone took down my video about stakes in ReZero. Yes, I'm still spiteful. Before I get into my quick review, there is only one Volume 7 light novel change to note, which is how in front of Subaru, Lust turns into Emilia, still giving the same massive speech to Subaru, which closely mirrors a speech given by Pristella during Arc 4 that was cut from the anime. So, what I liked about this phase, well, everything to be honest. I have not a negative thing to say about Phase 2. The cast of antagonists we have to work with is amazing, all being interesting in their own ways. Further showings of Subaru's progression, no matter how hard it gets, he isn't giving in. The characters feel human, not always making the most logical decisions in the moment, like when Subaru doesn't call Reinhardt or when he freezes in Emilia's fight. The action reads quite well, and there's a lot of it in this arc, so that's good. Subaru and Betty's magical system is so unbelievably dope. Garfield has some amazing showing of his progression as well as tests of his character thus far. The stakes of this arc are well executed, and despite always getting higher each arc, never feel forced. Now for my expectations. Let's look at my expectations from the last phase. My first one was that Subaru will end up uniting the royal candidates against the Sin Archbishop of Wrath. This has not been entirely fulfilled, as Pristella is a wild card, plus the scope of the situation has expanded, so I'm gonna rewrite this one to say against the witch cult now. Subaru will fall pretty far mentally, is so far untrue, but we aren't done yet. Emilia, having been portrayed as fairly naive, this arc will do something that makes her grow into her own, is about half fulfilled. She got some really cool moments against Sirius, but it's not exactly what I meant. Sirius could be in Pristella to kill Subaru for his public accomplishment of killing Petaljuice. This one was incorrect. They are all gathered here for some other reason we are unaware of as far as I know. We will finally get a cool Subaru action scene is half fulfilled. I only say half because it was against Regulus, which is not fair. Now onto the 3 new expectations that I have. Number 1 is that Liliana seems to have a similar rule that sucks people into the Sin Archbishop of Wrath. Perhaps she will be vital in countering Sirius's body washing. Garfiel's mother's memories are also with Gluttony. It was 15 years ago, and it's no coincidence for her to be reintroduced in this arc right before Gluttony makes an appearance. And finally, there will be a reveal of a 4th person from the real world. That's about it for this phase. Thank you for watching my Phase 2 analysis and review. If you liked this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe for the funny YouTube algorithm. You can also follow me on Twitter, where I'm objectively correct about all things, always. And you can also go to my Discord down below, where we talk about My Hero Academia and ReZero. I also do live post my thoughts on the phase as I read them in the Discord, so if you want to read it before I make a video about it, or if you want to talk to me about it, you can go there. And that's about it. See ya.